Welcome. I'm Jeff Resnick, Senior Historian here at the National Library of Medicine of the National Institutes of Health. Thank you for joining us for today's National Library of Medicine History Talk. NLM History Talks promote awareness and use of NLM and related historical collections for research, education, and public service in biomedicine, the social sciences, and the humanities. NLM History Talks also support the commitment of the NLM to recognize the diversity of its collections, which span 11 centuries, encompass a range of digital and physical formats, and originate from nearly every part of the globe. Moreover, NLM History Talks foreground the voices of people of color, women, and individuals of a variety of cultural and disciplinary backgrounds who value these collections and use them to advance their research, their teaching, and their learning. So welcome, everyone. For those of you who wish to share questions with our speaker this afternoon, please use the live feedback button that you see underneath the video stream. So today I have the great pleasure and privilege of introducing Ren Capucao, who's completing a PhD in nursing at the University of Virginia, which emphasizes historical methods. A registered nurse, Ren holds a Master's of Science in Nursing degree, also from the University of Virginia. He is an accomplished digital humanist with an impressive portfolio of digital mapping projects communicating the history of Filipino nurses in the United States. Moreover, Ren is an accomplished scholar with numerous grants and fellowships to his name, including a pre-doctoral grant from the American Association for the History of Nursing, a Philippines Open Study Research Award from the U.S. Fulbright Research Program, and an Arts, Humanities, and Social Sciences Summer Research Grant from the University of Virginia. He's also received awards from the Association of Asian Studies of the Social Science Research Council, the University of Virginia School of Nursing, the University of Virginia Center for Global Innovation and Inquiry, and the University of Pennsylvania Barbara Bates Center for the Study of the History of Nursing. He's also received support from Virginia Humanities. Ren's combination of publications and interviews are as extensive as his academic honors. He's published several research and nursing practice articles in scholarly journals and popular publications, and he's co-authored recently and published a book entitled Raising Standards, Saving Lives, the History of the University of the Philippines Nursing. A variety of news outlets have also interviewed Ren about his expertise both in the history of nursing and his experiences as a nurse. Additionally, Ren is the curator of A Culture to Care, the History of Filipino Nurses in Virginia. This is an exhibition made possible through sponsorship he received from the Philippine Nurses Association of Virginia and Virginia Humanities. Traveling from the Philippine Cultural Center of Virginia to the Library of Virginia, the physical exhibition is now permanently housed at the University of Virginia School of Nursing's Bjoring Center for Nursing Historical Inquiry. His website, Ren Capucao, that's RenCapucao.com, presents a digitized version of the exhibition. On this site, Ren explains that care, health, well-being, and quality of life constitute key foci for nursing scholarship, and that he, in his work, advances this knowledge using interdisciplinary methods to reveal the messy care politics enmeshed in the lives of subaltern nurses who have traversed between bedside and the global healthcare arena for over a century. Ren's current research explores the transnational history of Filipino nurses through the analytics of race, gender, and disability. He joins us today to offer perspectives on this research as he has completed it at the National Library of Medicine and other historical collections. The title of his talk is Unfit to Nurse, Efficiency and Discipline at the Philippine General Hospital, 1898 to 1916. Ren, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we really look forward to your talk. Over to you.
Thank you, Jeff, and the National Library of Medicine for the warm invitation to be here today. Also, thank you to everyone here in attendance. I'm extremely humbled to share my research and indebted to the National Library of Medicine's archives for helping me piece together the subjectivities of Filipino nurses during the early 20th century with other materials I've gathered in public and private collections between the US and the Philippines, notably the National Archives at College Park and University of the Philippines Manila Heritage Project. And to begin, I'd like to tell the story of a Filipino student nurse who's central to my project. In 1916, Florentina Papa, originally from Canaling Tarlac, was 19 years of age and more than 100 miles away from home. undergoing her senior year as a student nurse at the Philippine General Hospital. She was a promising student with an exceptional record until one night on ward duty in August. Around 2 a.m., a post-operative patient besieged Florentina for a bedpan with assistance, but as no one was available to aid her in safely executing the procedure, the student nurse courteously asked the patient to wait. Her attention was then drawn to the care of a more ill patient. 2.5 hours flew by when the post-operative patient asked for the bedpan again. Yes, but please wait a minute, Florentina responded in the midst of charting the sicklier patient's vital signs. Both the student nurse and the post-operative patient were teeming with frustration, with the tension breaking when the patient began uttering vitriolic remarks against Florentina and the nursing profession in general. She requested the patient to refrain, but the latter continued to berate nursing as a form of servitude. No longer able to bite her tongue, a heated exchange erupted on the ward. At the end of the duty, Florentina submitted a report to her supervisor, acknowledging her lack of promptness that night and hoping to find a resolution between her and the patient. This letter to be called to the nursing superintendent's office, where instead of solace, she found acrimony. Florentina did not consider the seriousness of the situation, as she defended both her dignity and that of the profession. But the superintendent remarked, talking back to patients was a violation of nursing's code of conduct, and commented that patients and nurses had also complained about her, a stark and sudden contrast that juxtaposed her excellent record. Her case would be forwarded to the Student Welfare Committee for disciplinary action. Upon returning to the dormitory, she shared with a close friend her feelings of intractable repugnance from the turn of events, and for being treated like an animal or servant. She began preparing her resignation letter, but was stopped by her friend. The intervention aroused Florentina to vehemently retort that if I should remain in the hospital, I might commit suicide because I cannot stand the treatment I received, that I had better die than to live in dishonor. The friend managed to mollify her enough for the two to attend class together, but Florentina disappeared afterward. On August 18, 1916, at 11:40 a.m., her body was found on the bathroom floor of the dormitory in a dying state after drinking carbolic acid, and 40 minutes later, her spirit passed on. Unbeknownst to Florentina, her death instigated a strike at a scale previously unfelt by the American colonial government in the Philippines, occurring during a time of intense debate regarding the status of the island's sovereignty and the fitness of Filipinos for self-government. Fitness, according to historian Maximo Calao, who lived during this period, elicited constant, sometimes bitter discussion in the islands. It was a buzzword of the time, signaling a metonym for the ability to properly exercise the rights and freedoms of a liberal modern society. But fitness, as indicated by historian Jurgen Marshukat, also gained its popular corporeal meaning by the 20th century amidst social Darwinism and the progressive era. The body could now be conditioned to acquire fitness through physical exercise, diet, and health to improve individual efficiency. Thus, the trained nurse, who embodied a gendered aspiration of civic fitness, proved instrumental in not only instilling physical fitness in others, but also teaching proper ways of living. As I discuss my disability framework, I wanted to lay out some key definitions for reference. Fitness was part and parcel of the ableist imaginary underpinning US colonization of the Philippines that governed the meaning of a healthy body during the early 20th century. The idea of benevolent assimilation blanketed the superiority of Western civilization over the presumed backwardness of the islands, with the former citizenry becoming indicative of typical species functioning. In other words, it determined who was considered fully human and who had the capacity to partake in citizenship and exercise liberal rights. For the US, white able-bodied heteronormative men embodied typical species functioning. While women could attain the same level of fitness, the trained nurse represented the utmost gendered ability within a paternalistic hierarchy in which Filipinos were also subsumed. The ideal of fitness, however, proves an impossible ordeal for everyone amidst the increasing demands of society and the fluctuation of individuals' physical and mental capacities over time. The inability to live up to this ableist ideal breeds paranoia, confusion, fear, and inadequacy, which, as disability studies scholar Dan Goodley points out, provides just the right amount of temperature and nutrients for disableism to grow. Notwithstanding progress in the islands, Americans, including nurses, mitigated anxieties by continuing to describe the fitness of Filipinos as inferior, using terms such as physically weak, feeble-minded, and semi-invalid to reify the ability and disability binary between the colonizer and the colonized. Physical exercise thus becomes an integral aspect of the training of Filipino nurses. Indeed, Progress and modernization are central themes in the histories of medicine, public health, and nursing in the Philippines during American colonialism. Warwick Anderson describes how Americans utilized modern medical and public health practices to develop and defer Filipinos toward and from participatory citizenship. Writing extensively on the history of Filipino nurses, Catherine Choi provides a similar perspective, examining the role of professional nursing in the physical establishment of Filipino women for self-government. Through a critical analysis of disability, I attempt to unravel further the link between Filipinos and care that was constructed during the American colonial period. Under the colonial government, Filipino nurses were subsumed into linear narratives of development and celebrated for overcoming racial deficiencies. I explore the formative years of nursing at the Philippine General Hospital leading up to the dynamic events of 1916, examining the association of civic and physical fitness and the effective labor of Filipino nurses in between. Here, the ability of these nurses was always asymptotic, or always approaching but never reaching that of the American nurse. Filipino nurses navigating the frontier of progress were more susceptible to the pressures of ableism under the colonial limelight, and they remained vulnerable to the disabling structures of colonialism that masqueraded racial subjugation with progressive discourses of discipline and efficiency. As such, physical and psychological distress was part and parcel of the trial of fitness for Filipino nurses. To make the most of time, I'll fast forward to 1907, but I can answer questions about the groundwork laid by American nurses following US colonialization in 1898 at the end. Instead, I'll begin my narrative around the linked origins of the Philippine Training School for Nurses and the Philippine General Hospital. During the first decade of American colonialism in the Philippines, the training of Filipinos in nursing received many Western critics, as the ultra-democratic trained nurse signaled a higher order of fitness. Amidst plans to build a modern hospital, several members of the Philippine Commission, the American legislative body in the islands appointed by the US president, were not convinced that the annexation of a training school for nurses would lead to useful or practical results. There was no question about the demand for nurses in the islands. But if the social and health reform of the masses had already proved arduous, how could Indigenous women be trained in the profession of nursing? As seen here with a quote from American nurse leader Lavinia Dock, these women would have to undergo a metamorphosis to fit the sanitized image of the trained nurse. Her account, as Catherine Choi points out, reverberates the pervasiveness of scientific racism in nursing that positioned American women as superior despite the recent ascents of the profession during the latter half of the 19th century. Notwithstanding inhibitions on Filipinos' capacity to nurse, the imperative for locally trained nurses could not be denied. In 1907, the government passed Act Number 1688 to appropriate funds to construct the modern hospital, aptly named the Philippine General Hospital, as the institution would serve the entire country. As the hospital became a reality, Mary Coleman and Sophia Reyes, the American and Filipino matrons of the girls' dormitory at the Philippine Normal School, alongside Victor Heiser, the director of the Bureau of Health, successfully campaigned the government to greenlight a nurses training course, marking the beginning of the Philippine Training School for Nurses. Administrated by the Bureaus of Education and Health, the two-year course was housed within the girls' dormitory and served as a preliminary program for students interested in nursing, who would go on to finish their training at the Philippine General Hospital upon its completion. It mirrored American training school curriculums, operating as an experiment to assess Filipinos' fitness to nurse. The nurses' training course, however, got off to a rocky start, as Heiser had to continually cajole the handful of enrolled nurses with candy and flowers to remain in the program. These gestures proved ineffective in mitigating the students' disdain for the practical work of nursing, leading them to disavow collectively, "This is servants' work, we'll have no more to do with it." Their sentiments reflected the early demographic of the school, which comprised students from affluent families. These students' socioeconomic status reflected American nursing's practice of recruiting women from the middle and upper classes, as they were perceived as displaying the moral aptitude suited for the profession. So similarly, Philippine nursing would have to make domesticity and professionalism amenable to attract and retain students. Indeed, the perception of the nurse as a menial laborer, commensurate to the low servile status of the housemaid, also known as the muchacha, had to be overcome for the course to be successful. Troubled by the students' exit, Coleman proposed the idea of putting on a play to not only corral them back, but also transform the cultural meaning of nursing. She and Heiser wrote a drama that depicted nurses as heroines who saved persons from the jaws of death and hired professional actors to ensure the integrity of the production. They limited the attendance of the play to invitation only, carefully curating a guest list that included the wives of high-ranking officials alongside the former students. The exclusive event, filled to max capacity, proved a resounding success, as the students returned the next day with a fervor to continue their nursing studies. However, another impasse arose shortly thereafter in the form of these students' parents, who stormed Heiser's office following their daughter's first practical experience in the hospital. The parents believed their daughters had been disgraced and humiliated after providing care to patients of the opposite sex and demanded the students be returned home. They viewed the trained nurse with unfamiliarity, unlike the physician's role introduced during Spanish colonialism. The gendered role of the nurse in caring for strangers, particularly those of the opposite sex, challenged cultural norms that disavowed the employment of women outside the home and upheld conservative values around women's sexuality. Unable to break through to the parents, Heiser lambasted, "Now, I'm tired of all of this nonsense. Our American women are just as fine as yours, and they take up nursing careers without loss of dignity or self-respect. If you're so far behind in the scale of civilization that you can't realize this, take your daughters out of the school at once. I don't want them here any longer. I've given them the opportunity to learn an honorable profession, but you're just exactly what your critics." And at that moment, the parents interjected his polemic and reversed their position, pleading with him for an hour to retain their daughters before he relented. Amidst the implication of inferiority, Heiser managed to upsell nursing as a marker of the civilized. The students would go on to complete the academic year with commendation. Despite the snags, the nurse's training course gradually transformed the cultural image of the nurse as commensurate with the modern Filipino woman. Its success was indebted to the groundwork of the first students, who triumphed over American prejudices about the ability of Filipinos. In subsequent years, the valorization of nursing's progress overshadowed the grounded experiences of the student nurses who navigated the frontier of the profession. They required a sound mind, or at least cultivated one along the way, to remain resilient against the public's disparaging comments and misconceptions about nursing. Their intimate work with the masses was culturally disruptive, challenging gendered assumptions of women's work and displacing indigenous health practices. Indeed, the admission of the cohort to the Philippine Training School for Nurses in June 1908, according to one of its members, Cecilia Tan, initiated a journey where tears marked her footsteps. She recounted the severe criticism and widespread derision that she and her fellow peers faced from the public, who essentially considered nursing useless, asserting only few could fathom the courage, the perseverance, and the suffering her cohort embodied. This journey was not only emotionally turbulent, but also physically taxing on them. In just 2 months, they donned blue striped uniforms, white aprons, and white caps, and were thrown headfirst into the containment of a cholera epidemic at the civil hospital. This was part of their practical work, which entailed working 6 hours a day, with off-duty occurring every 2 weeks. The schedule of balancing classes and ward duty proved draining on students, but as the ideal nurse practiced self-abnegation, they put on a bright and cheerful demeanor at the start of each duty, despite the recursive exhaustion. Amidst the drudgery, they alleviated themselves by finding joy in the quotidian aspects of their lives. During the morning commute from the dormitory to the hospital, some girls asked the ambulance driver to take the scenic route. After duty, they detoured through Luneta Park to listen to the music of bands playing and feel the breeze from Manila Bay gently caressing their skin. Outside of the course, they looked for opportunities for amusement, participating in athletics with other girls at the Philippine Normal School. These halcyon moments were the ones they cherished most. As the Philippine General Hospital neared completion, the government further invested in expanding its nursing labor force. Under Act No. 1931, it appropriated funds for the physical establishment of a training school on hospital grounds, which, upon completion, would become the new home of the Philippine Training School for Nurses. This law was followed by Act No. 1975, which reorganized the training school solely under the Bureau of Health, but more importantly, made the institution co-educational. And unfortunately, I don't have enough time to cover the significance of male students in this presentation, but I welcome questions about it at the end. Moving forward, the terms student nurse and graduate nurse now refer to both sexes. In September 1910, the hospital finally opened and would become the center of modern medicine in Asia, and a transnational marker of progress that inflated American exceptionalist attitudes. The hospital had 4 distinct objectives: to serve the health needs of the public, to afford an unparalleled service to government employees, to provide exceptional facilities for medical students, and to train nurses on a mass scale. With a 350-bed capacity, it was not only the largest and most modern hospital in the region, but was deemed by colonial authorities as comparable to the best hospitals in the Western world. Like other hospitals in the US, the Philippine General Hospital was a capital-intensive endeavor that warranted the implementation of scientific management practices to economize hospital efficiency. Scientific management began as a theory to improve economic performance in the industrial sector of the US, but it gained traction during the Progressive Era to encompass every aspect of cultural existence. Progressive reformers infused moral subjectivity into the objective rationales of scientific management to create a politics of efficiency that promoted a proper way of living. The definition of efficiency varied across fields, but within the hospital, it aimed to set order by conserving resources, streamlining services, and regimenting staff to economize operations. In the hospital, nurses were omniscient and trained to battle against disease and disorderly environments, making them rightfully fitted to reduce waste and oversee efficiency. Historians have postulated that nursing's propensity toward the application of scientific management principles demonstrated an attempt to etch out professional boundaries and claim an objective scientific space untaken by medicine. According to Susan Reverby, efficiency in nursing mediated service with science and made professionalization amenable to capitalist rationality. And amidst this calculus, character served as the ability deemed critical to the Reformation in both nursing and hospital care. Character can be read as fitness but tailored to nursing, and it formed the aspiration or ableist standard of the ideal nurse, who embodied Western cultural norms of womanhood and values of altruism, obedience, self-discipline, maternal expression, and self-abnegation. The ascetic and militant normal nurse, however, bred anxieties in maintaining this image amidst the physically and mentally taxing work and the growing demands of the modern hospital. Through eugenics, heredity could seemingly determine the aptitude to nurse with at least some degree of certainty. Scientific racism helped reduce the anxieties of white nurses by enforcing a racial divide between who was naturally the ideal nurse and who was suspended in the process of becoming one. At the Philippine General Hospital, American nurses assumed a superior class of character, training students and overseeing graduate nurses who, in their eyes, could only become pale imitations. In examining the colonial project of American nursing, historian Winifred Connerton astutely observes that hospital administrators identified American nurses' potential influence on nursing trainees was more important to the colonial goals than their direct patient care abilities, as they also believed that Filipino nurses' professional attitudes and behaviors could never quite measure up to the American standard. This established a racial division of labor where American nurses' duties primarily entailed the direct care of American patients and the supervision of ancillary staff and student nurses. Still, amidst the racial hierarchy, the colonial government prided the ability to nurse as a triumph of American benevolence. On April 9, 1912, the graduation of the second cohort of the Philippine Training School for Nurses was a highly politicized spectacle. It occurred at the Marble Hall, the assembly place of the Philippine legislature, with esteemed civil, medical, and religious leaders as speakers. The acting governor general of the islands handed out diplomas, and a student of each sex was honored with a medal for the highest efficiency record. This grand celebration signified the concerted efforts by the colonial government to raise the cultural value of nursing within the islands. The colonial government also leveraged nursing to advance the cultural image of the US as exceptional internationally. It deployed nursing's progress in the islands to demarcate the superior capabilities of Filipinos over the Japanese as a show of imperial power. For example, in a 1913 letter published in the Modern Hospital Journal, Wiley Woodbury, the hospital superintendent of the Philippine General Hospital, asserted the Philippines as having more promising material than Japan, which trained under an outdated German model. He also contended the course of instruction offered by the Philippine Training School for Nurses is probably not excelled by any training school in the world, and I do not recall to mind any school in the United States that provided better facilities for teaching than are found here. Woodbury's haughtiness regarding American nursing and the ability of Filipino nurses was undergirded by geopolitics. The growing imperial presence of Japan raised American anxieties and loomed over debates of Philippine independence and US responsibility over protecting a territory considered so far in distance and development. In closing out his letter, he stressed that the graduate Filipino nurse ranks next to the American. This reified the proximal and unequal status between the colonizer and the colonized. Therefore, his claim that the educational excellence of the Philippine Training School for Nurses was unmatched paradoxically constructs graduates who are capable, but also not quite. The Philippine General Hospital, according to the historian Warwick Anderson, was a microcosm of the colonial polity demanding white American order and efficiency. There, American nurses largely viewed themselves as in charge of directing nursing services. They were the master spirits directing its growth and efficiency. This included overseeing the performance of Filipino nurses. The paternalistic nature of colonial benevolence framed the Filipino body as innately disabled, inefficient, and unproductive, with several Filipino workmen equal to one American. This valuation of bodies was supported by the salaries of American nurses, whose wages were at double that of Filipino peers in the same position. As such, the economic value of American nurses affirmed their authority in extracting labor from Filipino nurses for the sake of efficiency. However, the racial division of labor supporting the illusion of American nurse superiority began to loosen as American nurses proved difficult to recruit and as more cohorts of Filipino nurses graduated. The latter were now also trespassing upon the former's responsibilities in the American wards. American nurses, as historian Catherine Choi points out, entertained the idea that Filipino nurses might become their equals in the future, but not in the present time or their presence. While colonial authorities praised the shifting demographic of the hospital, Filipino nurses' grounded experiences, particularly on the American ward, illustrate a more precarious tale of progress. Gregoria Ibarra, a 20-year-old graduate nurse employed on the American ward, was considered a competent and devoted nurse with a cheerful disposition. But on May 9, 1914, she was found dead in her quarters after imbibing mercury dichloride. In the days leading to her death, she demonstrated signs of depression and nervousness, with hospital staff describing her as forgetful and very nervous, talking loudly and excitedly to the nurses on the floor, listless at times, and crying in the late hours of the night. Many speculated that overwork was the cause of her deteriorating health and work performance, as she cared for her paralytic father in the hospital when off duty. Before Gregoria's death, she had addressed letters to the chief nurse, friends, and relatives, bidding them farewell. These letters also divulged her claims of receiving severe and constant reprimand from American nurse supervisor Mabel Dobbs. The Manila Times newspaper suggested that on top of the demands of work and her inability to improve her father's failing health, the deprivation she faced had lowered her self-esteem enough to push her to the edge. The investigation following her death found accusations of verbal abuse groundless, and its decision would set a precedent for individual culpability on acts counterexample to progress or the norm, foreshadowing the case of Florentina's death in the coming years. By 1914, the supplantation of Americans with Filipinos at the Philippine General Hospital was well underway alongside other institutions of the Philippine Civil Service. The turnover of Americans was part of Governor General Francis Burton Harrison's Filipinization policy that began in 1913 and aimed to have Filipinos completely occupy government and civil servant positions in preparation for Philippine independence. Harrison's appointment under President Woodrow Wilson marked the first time the Democratic Party had control over the islands. As such, Filipinization received admonishment primarily from Republicans and retentionists like Dean Worcester, the former Secretary of the Interior, and Heiser, who lambasted the policy for ruining the progress made thus far. They considered that the Philippines was still developing and Filipinos remained unfit for self-government. Still, Heiser had praised the Filipinization of nursing services at the hospital the previous year, with the remaining 8 American nurses signaling Filipino nurses' fitness. He made particular commendations about the graduates employed as instructors at the training school, stating that they have in every instance proven their ability to carry on the work of their predecessors. So if there was one area of development that proved ready for autonomy, he believed it was nursing. However, Filipinization at the Philippine General Hospital remains a site of political tension. The institution underwent reorganization following Winfred Dennison's appointment as Secretary of the Interior, as he attempted to improve the institution's reputation. On February 5, 1915, the passage of Act Number 2467 led to major changes at the Philippine Training School for Nurses. The training school became a department of the hospital and had its academic curriculum overseen by the University of the Philippines. These changes were cemented by the renaming of the training school to the Philippine General Hospital School of Nursing. By the start of the 1915-1916 academic year, the School of Nursing had cumulatively produced 146 graduates and currently enrolled around 200 students. As seen by these maps, they hailed across more than 180 towns with one international student from Suzhou, China. the rapid development of nursing cannot be solely credited to American ingenuity, as student and graduate nurses provided the intimate work of care across the islands. The colonial government would report that the hospital in 1915 had one of the most successful fiscal years in its history regarding the volume and quality of work performed. However, this contrasted with the diatribe of Ossie Jones, a former member of the Philippine Department of Education, who described the hospital that year as being the most conspicuous example of disorganization and inefficiency that materialized from under the evil effects of the present regime. He failed to provide evidence supporting his accusation, but it was not without merit. Controversy arose around the School of Nursing and its questionable culture of discipline, which ultimately led all members of its external advisory board to resign in July 1915. The advisory board comprised prominent Filipino women in the community, notably its president, Sofia Reyes de Vera, who, now married, had helped conceive professional nursing at girls' dormitory. One student nurse described de Vera as the angel of the nurses for encouraging many girls to enter the profession and befriending hundreds of them. The board's purpose was to cooperate with hospital authorities on matters regarding the school and the welfare of the student body. Prior to its resignation, the board had involved itself in the complaints of students regarding the disciplinary taken by the nursing superintendent. It attempted to mediate the two parties by forwarding cases to Secretary Dennison, but he ruled that the board had no jurisdiction over matters between individual students and hospital authorities, as their intervention impeded the hospital's efficiency. It also determined that any nurse in the future seeking assistance from external parties regarding disciplinary measures by hospital authorities would be grounds for expulsion. His ruling understood the Philippine General Hospital as holding international attention and acted to safeguard the institution's progressive image already under attack. However, this ruling was an affront to the very function of the advisory board and the primary cause for its resignation. In a letter to Secretary Dennison, the board asserted that undesirable and unsatisfactory conditions of the school resulted from ill-suited disciplinary measures straining the relationship between students and Superintendent McCloskey. And despite its attempt to assist in the settlement of controversies arising from the complaining nurses and the hospital authorities, no consideration satisfactory to the board has ever been given to the different matters in this. Discipline subject that would continue to redress, more so as external bodies were no longer involved in the hospital's internal affairs. Now, the voice of prominent Filipinos could no longer raise concerns or challenge American hospital authorities. As such, the disciplinary culture of the school became unchecked, and students' frustrations began to fester. On May 3, 1916, William Musgrave, the director of the General Hospital, trying to increase hospital efficiency, announced the introduction of an athletics course into the training school curriculum. However, athletics was already a mainstay at the school, as it already took as it required all students to partake in systematic exercise. Its implementation was novel, considering a study of American training school curricula conducted 12 years later depicted that of 9 schools, only 3 had a course dedicated to physical education. At the Philippine General Hospital School of Nursing, the current athletics course had male and female students meet separately once a week for calisthenics. But students could also partake in sports clubs, including tennis, basketball, indoor baseball, and volleyball. Nonetheless, Musgrave insisted that the current iteration was elective. What made his course different was its heightened physical demand on students. The new athletics course that began on May 15 required students of both sexes to report promptly to the athletic grounds at 4:20 p.m. to exercise for 45 minutes 5 times a week. Physical exercise emerged in American nursing to measure and condition students' ability to endure and strenuous demands of patient care. For American nurse educator Clara Cahoon, it could rejuvenate the health of students robbed by the tireless demands of the training school. Her contemporary, Myrtle Young, however, looked beyond individual well-being to capitalize on the value of conditioning bodies to meet the demands of the modern hospital. She positioned the use of physical exercise to correct bodily weaknesses and improve the physical efficiency of nurses. Her position did not exist within a vacuum, but amidst the movements of scientific management and racism. The belief that the Filipino body was inherently feeble made Filipino nurses vulnerable to disciplinary measures promoting individual efficiency like physical exercise. Musgrave reasoned that his athletics course was necessary to improve the fitness of Filipino nurses, asserting, Nursing is the most arduous occupation known for women in public life. And even in the United States, with its larger and physically stronger class of women than exist over here, more failures in individual nurses are due to physical reasons than to any other one cause. My experience of many years in this country and the analysis of the records of our school show that physical inefficiency is the greatest obstacle to the advancement of the profession of nursing in this country, and the larger percentage of those who fail for physical reasons rather than for any other reasons. This
Ren,
racialization.
excuse me, this is Jeff, obviously.
Yes.
Could I ask you, I'm sorry to interrupt you, I apologize. Could you pause for just a moment while we try to troubleshoot your sound?
Of course.
Your bandwidth is degrading through no fault of anybody's, and we're going to try something behind the scenes here to smooth things out. So thank you very much. And to everyone watching, please, can we have your patience for just a moment? Thank you. I'll be right back with you. Thank you. So we did do a robust sound check before Ren's talk, but these things happen. Technology is what it is. So thank you all for your patience, and we'll be right back with you in just a moment. Ren, your talk is fantastic, and I have several great questions for you that I think you'll appreciate to tease out the meaning of some of the things that you've raised. So really do look forward to the Q&A at the conclusion of the talk. Thank you. And thank you again for your patience. And I do apologize for interrupting you. This is actually the first time I've ever needed to do this. And again, just due to a sound issue that we want to try to troubleshoot. So we're working on it.
No worries. I tend to have bad luck anyway, so it's bound to happen.
So Ren, we're going to move, when you're ready, we're going to move to your next slide. So back to you. And if you give your verbal cue, we will then move the slides for you.
Okay, so I'm not controlling slides anymore.
Okay. So can you repeat that? You're not showing slides.
Oh, sorry. I'm not controlling the slides anymore. You guys are, or?
Correct. Yeah, we're going to shift that over. Yeah. So when you want to move to the next slide, just just say so.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay.
Should I go ahead and begin, Jeff?
One moment, please.
Okay.
Yes, please continue, and we'll pick it up from here. Thank you again, Ren, for your patience, and to everyone watching, thank you all for your patience. Ren, back to you. Please continue, and just when you want us to change slides, just we'll go ahead and do that. Thank you.
Sounds good, and thank you everyone for your patience. So I just finished reading William Musgrave's quote, so I'm just continuing where I left off, and the quote's just finished. His racialization of Filipino nurses as physically weaker than their American counterparts inferred that their bodies could be pushed further to be more efficient and productive. In other words, the expected inefficiency of Filipino nurses not only prevented their equal status to American nurses, but also made their bodies more vulnerable to labor extraction. Next slide. The implementation of the new athletics course, however, was not smooth, being met with passive resistance from the students. Michael Walsh, the athletics instructor, observed the is that the right slide? Oh, sorry, Jeff. I'm not sure if that's the right slide. Yeah, that's the one. Sorry about that. 1 second. Yeah. The implementation of the new athletics course, however, was not smooth, being met with passive resistance from the students. Michael Walsh, the athletics instructor, observed the perfunctory participation of female students, who often lagged while running. To counteract this, he required the girls to hold the hands of their male peers while running laps. The practice of hand-holding, however, was discontinued after several attempts due to the perceived visual discomfort and complaints received. This corrective action was odd considering physical contact between the opposite sexes outside of marriage was seen as taboo in Filipino and American cultures. Over time, absences and tardiness among senior students became more visible. To counteract these silent protests, the hospital administration on August 17 began stricter disciplinary measures for each sex, with senior male students' punishment proving the most severe. While girls had dormitory privileges revoked and insignia on their caps removed, boys had to scrub the toilets of 3 hospital units for 2 hours each day for 1 week, in addition to their regular 8-hour duty. Abruptly, however, punishments for students demonstrating good behavior were suspended the following day. The sudden leniency on August 18 coincided with the suicide of Florentina, although Musgrave attested that this event did not influence the suspension of punishments. Amidst the built-up tension around the Philippine General Hospital, the local press incited public outrage. Newspapers lambasted the hospital, particularly targeting Musgrave and McCloskey, and spun a narrative that blamed the hospital's inefficiency on American incompetency. Next slide. Headlines about the hospital coincided with those on the Jones Bill, a proposed U.S. legislation introduced in 1912 that endeavored a formal commitment to Philippine independence. The bill's current iteration was set to become law by the U.S. Congress in the coming weeks. It would further institutionalize a democratic republic in the Philippines and grant Filipinos autonomy over the bicameral legislature, but maintained executive powers of a U.S. appointed governor general until independence could be granted upon proof of a stable government. According to Maximo Calao, the bill had a primary defect. It forced Filipinos to prove their ability for self-government in an alien political system where their share in governance remained minor. The Jones Bill would become law on August 29, 1916, but on the same day as if to challenge the precondition of a stable government. Next slide. Student nurses at the Philippine General Hospital orchestrated a strike at a scale previously unseen in the history of the Philippine civil service. The coincidence and quick organization of the strike warrants inquiry about whether political forces were involved. Nonetheless, however, students walking out on their duties demonstrated plucky to stand against hospital authorities. They submitted a petition to Musgrave that jointly served as their unofficial resignation. The petition objected to the strict or rather rigid punishments unjustly applied at times upon students, with Florentina being one of the many casualties of this injustice, and sought to reform the hospital's disciplinary culture. Discipline, as referred to by the students, entailed the physical conditioning and punishing of student bodies. Students' primary grievance centered around the new athletics course. However, the student body was not completely unified in the strike, as some students claimed their signatures were coerced or lacked informed consent. Still, up to 150 students, alongside several graduate nurses, partook in the strike and temporarily disrupted hospital services. The strike lasted 2 days before being quelled by the police force and U.S. Army reserves. Students who led the strike or refused to return to duty until resignations were formally approved were blacklisted from future employment in the civil service. Next slide. Following the strike, Governor General Harrison appointed Everett Colson, the Director of Civil Service, to lead the investigation of the hospital's disciplinary culture spanning the past 3 years. During the investigation, tensions remained high as an attempt was made on Musgrave's life, who survived a meal laced with poison. The investigation concluded nearly 2 months later, as Colson publicly released the special report of the investigation of the Philippine General Hospital on October 21. The report determined the athletics course was necessary, viewing the replacement of American nurses as a premature act that endangered the efficiency of the hospital due to Filipino nurses' relative lack of physical ability. It also deemed the punishments for tardiness and absence as appropriate. Next slide. While the report exonerated hospital authorities of all wrongdoing, its logic more importantly illustrates the hospital's ableist culture. Over the course of 3 years, the hospital witnessed the death of 5 student and graduate nurses, 2 of whom were suicides. In addition, it also experienced 3 alleged suicide attempts. These numbers prove alarming considering that a three-year study of 23 American training schools in 1907 reported the largest death count among them was 2. So why was the mortality risk among Filipino nurses so high? This risk was arguably related to the pressures faced by American and Filipino nurses aspiring to be the ideal nurse and the changing dynamics of the hospital amidst Filipinization. For For each case of suicide and alleged attempt, the report conflated shortcomings with poor character and mental instability. This connection reproduced medical literature, reifying the inferiority of the Filipino race. Significantly, Musgrave's research on tropical neuropsychological disorders dives deeper into its position on implementing the athletics course and, more broadly, the overall fitness of Filipino nurses. His research determined that hysterical character and childlike temperament were all but universal among Filipinos. It further stated that only a few had the mental fortitude to handle the stress of Western civilization, which is why these disorders prevailed among those who were trying to adopt Western methods of energy, application, and efficiency, and who were unprepared by breeding, training, or environment to do so. It also normalized self-destruction as an act executed among persons of a low-order mentality. His research clearly conveyed an association between Filipino nurses' lack of ability and self-harm, whereas acts of self-harm were deemed inevitable. Medicalization of Filipino fitness provided the teleological explanation for imposing culpability on the individual rather than the hospital. Yet a close analysis of the cases reveals the ableist environment that subsumed the affected nurses, as a pattern emerges in their elicited feelings and behaviors, whether from their own words or eyewitness accounts. They collectively express depression, anger, stress, and fear, often in relation to receiving admonishment from American nurse supervisors. This relationship rendered Filipino nurses powerless under the hospital chain of command. In two of the alleged attempts, Agrippina de Ocampo and Maria Filotio claimed their drug overdoses were not suicidal, but rather efforts to alleviate work-related stress. Both nurses learned about their chosen drug effects in their Materia Medica course and the potential consequences of overdosing. Thus, their willingness to experiment with the improper use of drugs depicted agency and desperation in coping with the unclear bar set by American nurses. These cases illuminate the pressures of constantly having to prove one's fitness regarding race and professionalism. Next slide. Following the report's release, public outrage erupted and was fanned by the press. And trailing not far behind was the resignation of McCloskey and Musgrave. The sequence of events from August to October 1916 expedited Filipinization at the Philippine General Hospital and led a Filipino nurse to succeed McCloskey in the highest nursing position in the islands. Assuming the role was Anastasia Hiron, a 1912 graduate of the training school who received postgraduate training in the US and was mentored by Jane Delano, the founder of the American Red Cross nursing service. Hiron's experience abroad brought her closer to the American standard of the nurse and made her a viable candidate to lead Philippine nursing under colonial supervision. In the wake of the strike, colonial government reports conceded that the hospital was operating upon a more satisfactory basis than ever before and was running smoothly and harmoniously under the administration of Filipinos. Nursing's formative years and institutionalization in the Philippines centered around the Philippine General Hospital. Here, colonial authorities subverted Filipinos' attitudes to take up the profession as a celebratory sign of progress made possible only under American ingenuity. This linear narrative of progress, however, is perforated by examining the grounded experiences of Filipino nurses that demonstrated the fluidity of ability and disability. The ableist character of the ideal nurse set impossible standards and instilled a precarious identity among Americans and Filipinos. Anxieties only grew among hospital authorities amidst Filipinization and as Filipinos continued to demonstrate a prowess in nursing. These feelings espoused the hospital to implement disabling discourses of discipline and efficiency, undermining Filipinos' fitness to maintain the status quo of colonial and nursing hierarchies. Student nurses' pent-up frustrations with the hospital disciplinary culture led to the 1916 strike at the hospital. This strike forcefully challenged the claims of colonial benevolence in being led by those who bore the duty of care. It was a collective demand by Filipino nurses to be treated as subjects rather than objects of care. The colonial narrative depicts the strike as a blow to modern progress and an event unworthy of historical memory, but an alternative reading like this signals the strike as a watershed moment for Philippine nursing. Filipino nurses gained autonomy over the nursing profession to better tailor care to the health needs of the Filipino people and, most importantly, decide for themselves who was fit to be a nurse. And next slide. And that's the end of my presentation. And thank you everyone for listening in.
Ren, thank you very much. Great presentation. And thank you again for your patience as we were troubleshooting the sound, which did correct itself to some degree. So thank you.
Of course, I'm glad.
So what I'd like to do is remind our viewers that we're going to be taking questions through the live feedback button, which is underneath the video stream. So do send your questions there. They will come to me and I will see them on the screen over here. And I will be happy to ask them to our speaker. Ren, thank you again. So a few questions. You're very welcome. It's a privilege to host you and to learn about your work and the sources that you've drawn on. And some of the questions actually pertain to the depth and breadth of your sources. So the first question that's come in, thank you for this fascinating talk. The idea of a co-educational nursing program in the early 1900s is intriguing. You mentioned that the idea of female nurses providing care for male patients was initially met with shame. Was there a corresponding societal challenge to male nurses treating female patients, or did they simply avoid having that situation occur?
From my understanding of examining male nurse students, the reasons why they were incorporated is more so to kind of still maintain that gender division of care. So for men nurses, they were there to still take care of mostly male patients, but also they were essential to the Colonial project in terms of paving the infrastructure for nursing, where trying to bring they sent men nurses outwards beyond the hospital as well to act kind of as more trained sanitarians, to replace military officers as trained sanitarians, to do the work of public health in remote villages and areas. So they deemed this was like inappropriate or improper for women to do. So that's the main need for these male students. And it's interesting to see that these students, like eventually, like we wonder where all of these male nurses went, because it was pretty prominent. Like the early classes, it was pretty much 50-50 between the gender ratio. But eventually we see these male nurses trail off by the 1920s because I guess their purpose was no longer valued. But for the most part, it male nurses continued to work within the gendered hierarchy of nursing. But at the same time, if you look at the broader Colonial project, the status of these like men in nurses, like if you look at the culture of nursing in the U.S., like men in nursing was not a high status. They were put below female nurses. So for these male nurses to be kind of lauded and touted as great in the Philippines, it's interesting to see what it's doing to kind of reify the cultural backwardness of Filipinos in the country by allowing and maintaining to pursue nursing.
Thank you. Thank you. So on the heels of that answer, there's a question that I'd like to ask you that came in through the live feedback button about the variety of sources that you drew on. So you mentioned, you alluded to male nurses, they trailed off, into the 1920s, respectfully. Someone writes in, I'm curious about the extent to which you drew on published memoirs of the period written decades later. Did you find any such sources, or perhaps no? And a related question is, to what extent were there oral histories that you drew on to construct your narrative, understanding that this was in the 19-teens and early 20s? But if you could speak to the source material. We've received several questions in this regard.
So in this case, I've managed to kind of dig deeper into the subjectivity of Filipino nurses during this period there are a few oral histories of nurses, but these are it's different from these nurses, I would say this time. They're from this period, but they all look, this is another part of my project I haven't been able to talk about, but these nurses are they're early migrants who moved actually to the U.S. during the early 1920s. But there are actually oral histories of these nurses who of their experience in nursing in the Philippines and their times in the U.S. But they talk about their training in the Philippines as well. So I'm drawing on those. I'm drawing on so many different newspaper articles, local newspapers of the time period. There was even like a lot of material I was able to grab was they actually published a yearbook in 1915 from the Philippine General Hospital School of Nursing that was published. Like the editors were the students themselves, so you're seeing a lot of what they think about nursing and how they feel, and so it's really hard to piece all of this together, but it that's I guess what I've had to do is dig through so many different source material to be able to piece it together and make sense. Because I guess this alternative reading of looking deeper into, but beyond, like for example, the strike itself, like it's kind of erased from history and it's not viewed as important. But by looking at it from the student, like the perspectives of the Filipino students and nurses themselves, you kind of see this unattainable standard that keep being pushed up against, and you kind of see where the strike goes. So whether or not it was like politically motivated, there's still importance in what they did.
Of course. And my guess is some of the contours of what you're sharing. I'm prompted to ask you, when you find a particular source and you're looking for those pieces to help construct your narrative, when you do find one, whatever it is, you're probably, metaphorically jumping up and down, because it does help you piece together the narrative that you're constructing. So you do have to, look very far and wide. And when you find those pieces, they come together probably very nicely. So I've gotten that sense from the shape of your narrative, and you've done an excellent job constructing, drawing on all those different sources, visual and textual. It's really well done.
Thank you.
And in fact, another question that's come in, the hospital production you mentioned sounded fascinating. In learning about this, did you find any sources beyond what this person understood to be the newspaper account of it? Did you find any production notes or script or any other contemporary reflections on that production?
Production as in the amount of students, I guess, the number of graduates were produced, or
I think this person's referring to, in the first third of your presentation, you talked about a play that was produced.
Yes.
Yeah, not production of students, but rather.
Sorry about that.
I think by production notes, they're suggesting the theatrical production that you alluded to.
Yes. Sorry, could you repeat the question? I was like forward on.
The hospital production, the theatrical production you mentioned, sounded fascinating. In learning about this, did you find any sources beyond what seems to be the newspaper account of it? Any production notes, script, or any other contemporary reflections on it?
For sure. So for the actual play, that from the original play itself was written in the memoir of Victor Heiser in an American Odyssey. So you can read about it in there. But for the picture that I showed, since I needed a picture, but for the play I showed, that was actually in another yearbook, in the yearbook of the Philippine Normal School. So I'm seeing different cases where this play, it's continuing on, where the nurse keeps being embodied as the modern woman, and how it becomes so ingrained into this is part of how it becomes ingrained into the culture of the Philippines itself.
Mm-hmm. Understood. Thank you. So we have time for two more questions. Are there specific aspects of your work which you would like to expand, and for any particular reasons?
Oh, most definitely. So for the slide I showed, or the photographs I've showed of the male students, the presentation I just showed is like the first chapter of my dissertation. So the second chapter actually delves deeper into what happens after the strike. So amidst the strike, immediately, as students walked out, the hospital already sent out letters across the Philippines. Whoever's on the waiting list, because there's a huge waiting list for the school. Whoever's on the waiting list, like, come to the hospital, we need you now, and they would be admitted. So one of the students I showed in that slide on the right side, the male student, is actually one of the students that was brought to the hospital. Like, he got a letter like right away to go to the hospital, and it explores his journey. His journey was to become a physician through nursing, and it's interesting because in the original like catalog of the Philippine Training School for Nurses, it says that nursing is a good stepping stone for those who want to pursue medicine. And so this specifically speaks to men who where obviously nursing is not the gender, like the it's not the paternal role that they're supposed to assume. So a lot of them pursue this route in nursing to go to medicine. And so since there's limited medical schools in the Philippines, they have access to go to the US since they are considered US nationals. So I follow his story to the US where he is in on his way to become a physician, but then we see all of these barriers that keep popping up from medical licensure, preventing aliens or people who are unable to become citizens to become licensed as physicians. And of course, during that period of the early 20th century, the only people who are really barred from gaining citizenship are Asians. And so we're seeing this by the time the Philippines, by 1934, when it loses its national status, where it loses the national status for citizenship, then it becomes a problem for Filipinos. But in that way, I guess I'm examining like the weathering process of the wearing down of upon the health of these characters. Whereas we see in his journey, by the time he does get into medical school, he's applying as a 50-year-old man, and he gets in. And it's funny, his recommendation letters basically still, but they're by white physicians. They describe him as boy still, as a Filipino. He's a good Filipino boy. But anyways, he gets in, but then within the first couple of weeks, he dies of heart conditions. And so we're seeing the long process of weathering that's happening upon these there's these ableist structures that are preventing them from succeeding. And so that's what I guess the project I'm like excited about, I suppose, that I wish I could share. I just don't have enough time.
Well, you've shared just a taste of it that we look forward to learning more about when inevitably you complete your degree and publish your book,
Yes.
which I know I'll look forward to reading, as do many people. So this leads us to our final question. Someone writes in a fantastic work by a nurse historian. What's next for you and your work, professionally speaking? So you're working on your PhD. When do you expect to receive that? And what do you think about your next steps? Because you're wonderful in both fields.
Well, it's now time crunch because I was going to tell you actually sooner if you wanted to include in the introduction, but I didn't want to jinx myself. But I just found out I received a Mellon postdoc at UVA. So I just have to defend my dissertation by August or by July, by the end of July. So that's the deadline. And it's to go through this process of learning more. So how to further integrate the importance of the history of nursing into healthcare or nursing curriculums, also its importance to healthcare policy as well. Because when I was doing my Fulbright in the Philippines per se, like I was writing the book, that Raising Standards, Saving Lives, in tandem with the University of the Philippines College of Nursing, the dean, uh, specifically, and the health, the issues there are so they mirror the US, but it's on a different scale. And we're seeing like the legacy of colonialism affecting the impact on the nursing profession over there. And I think this history has so much value in shaping policy. It's just we have to keep pushing it out. These stories that are important to, I don't know, understanding the contemporary times, like the contemporary issues we're facing. And so I think that's my goal is to, I don't know, eventually publish a book, but also continue being engaged on the ground um, with the nurses that I work with and continuing to make global changes if possible to make healthcare access equitable for everyone, truly.
Well, firstly, congratulations on your news, on
Thank
your
you.
postdoc. Secondly, my colleagues and I at the National Library of Medicine, and certainly everyone watching, wish you every continued success on your professional journey from nursing and history to policy. And if we ourselves could be a further resource for you through access to our collection, don't hesitate to be in touch. And I know colleagues across all institutions that hold material that inform your work warmly welcome you to be in touch and we wish you every continued success. Great talk, and you're onward toward wonderful further success, without a doubt. So thank you, Ren, very much for your time this afternoon, for preparing your talk, and thank you again for your patience with our technical challenge, which is just the nature of things these days. So thanks again, and we look forward to keeping in touch.
Thank you.
So with thanks again to Ren Capucao for his fantastic talk, I'd like to share with everybody news about our next NLM History Talk on May 30th. That's a Thursday. Burning Contagion, organized arson in response to quarantine facilities and pest houses, 1858 to 1901. An intriguing talk to be offered by Lorna Ebner, who's a PhD candidate in the history department of the State University of New York at Stony Brook. So please join us on May 30th at 2 p.m. Eastern Time for Laura Ebner's talk. And with that, and with thanks again to Ren Capucao, I wish you a great remainder of the day. And thank you so much for tuning in to the National Library of Medicine's History Talk program today. And we hope you'll tune in to future programs. And we appreciate your interest, your engagement. And if we at the National Library of Medicine can be a resource for you in your research through access to our collection, please do not hesitate to contact us. And we look forward to being in touch and being a resource for you. Thanks to everybody, and thanks again to Ren Capucao. Have a good day. Bye-bye.